Welcome to the Mutt's American Crime, where we uncover the darkest corners of American history, one crime at a time. I'm your host, the Mutt, and today's story is one of betrayal, espionage, and a shocking execution. The tale of Captain George Kendall, the first man executed in the American colonies. Stay tuned because this is a story that is filled with twists, turns, danger, and lots of questions that are still being unpacked today. Before we dive in, let's set the stage. It's 1600s colonial America, a time of exploration, hardship, and fragile alliances. The New World was a vast and untamed wilderness, and life for the settlers was a daily struggle for survival. But even in this early period of American history, the seeds of espionage and betrayal were already being planted. George Kendall was a man with a curious story. He was born in England. Kendall wasn't just a regular settler, however. He was an officer, a captain, a man of influence, and even rumored to be the cousin of the third Earl of Pembroke. By 1607, he found himself among the early colonists at Jamestown, Virginia, one of the first English settlements in the New World. But instead of carving out a new life in the colonies like the others, Kendall would soon find himself facing a much darker fate. It all began with the arrival of the Virginia Company of London, the powerful entity backing the Jamestown settlement that wanted to make sure that their investment paid off, and they needed to ensure loyalty. It was a delicate time. Tensions between the settlers and the indigenous Powhatan people were rising. And even then, something happened that would change the course of history. Kendall was accused of espionage. Now, you might be wondering, what was George Kendall accused of exactly? Was he a spy? A traitor? The truth is murky, even by today's standards. What we do know is that in 1609, Kendall was arrested and charged with treason for allegedly spying for Spain. The accusation was a serious one, and betrayal of the colony at, at its most fragile moment. If the charges were true, it would mean that Kendall had been secretly working with Spain to undermine the colony's survival. And in an age where loyalty meant life or death, this was the kind of charge that warranted a swift and brutal response. But there's where the story takes another twist. Some historians question whether the charges were real at all. Was Kendall truly guilty of espionage, or was this simply a case of political maneuvering? In the unforgiving environment of early colonial life. A power struggle where one man's fate was decided by whispers in dark corners and the need to maintain control over a valuable settlement. Let's go back to the trial, shall we? The evidence against Kendall was sketchy at best. Most of the accusations were based on circumstantial evidence and confessions under duress. There were no concrete facts, no hard proof that he was working with Spain. But in the harsh and lawless world of early Jamestown, that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was seen as a threat. And in a place where survival was precarious, the colony couldn't afford such a risk. On December, on December 1st, 1609, Captain George Kendall was sentenced to death. The charge, treason. His punishment, execution by firing squad. One of the earliest in American colonial history. But even as Kendall stood before the firing squad, something strange happened. According to some, Kendall didn't beg for his life. He didn't protest. Instead, he reportedly asked for a moment of silence before the shot rang out, as if accepting his fate. But here's the thing, we'll never really know what was going through his mind in that final moment. Excuse me. So, was George Kendall guilty of treason, or was he a victim of the power struggle among the early colonists? Some believe that the charges were fabricated to get rid of a man who had become inconvenient to certain powerful figures, namely the newly elected president of the colony, Edward Marie Wingfield, who, in the words of Captain John Smith, yes, that John Smith, and this is a direct quote, would admit no exercise at arms or fortification, but the boughs of trees cast together in the form of a half moon by the extraordinary pains and diligence of Captain Kendall. Later, the colony's blacksmith was sentenced to hang for striking a representative of the king, the newly appointed John Ratcliffe, in a fight. James Reed, the man sentenced to the gallows, asked to speak in private with Ratcliffe. It was during this conversation that James Reed informed Ratcliffe that Kendall was actually guilty of protecting the local Powhatan people, supposedly. Ratcliffe dropped the charges against Reed and had Kendall rearrested. Some of you may be asking, where was Edward Marie Wingfield, the very first elected president of the colony? Well, he had been charged with other crimes and was sentenced to return to England to stand trial himself. That, however, is a whole other story. The execution of George Kendall is an eerie reminder of the dangers that lurked in the early days of colonial America. In a world where loyalty was everything, the line between friend and foe was often blurred. Whether he was guilty or not, Kendall became a symbol of just how far the New World was willing to go to ensure its survival. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mutt's American Crime. If you want to keep deep dives into the dark history of America's past, be sure to subscribe and leave us a comment or a review. We'll be back next week with another crime that is shaped that helped shape the nation in ways you might not expect. And remember, history may have forgotten the truth, but we're here to dig it up. So stay tuned.